Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're discussing OKRs and KPIs for alignment with some great panelists. Unfortunately, Linda Davidson has had to drop out today, but don't worry, we still have an excellent lineup for you. As a way to introduce everyone to the panel, I'll introduce each member and I also have a starter question for each panelist as well to do something just a little bit different. So the first person I'll introduce is Aviv Ben Yosef, who's a tech executive consultant. Welcome Aviv, could you give us a short intro about yourself?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm based in Israel. I help my clients triple their impact per engineer, and I recently published my new book, The Tech Executive Operating System.
Excellent. Great to have you here. And as a first question, just to kick off to you, you've seen CTOs aren't sure that OKRs actually apply to their organization. Why is that?
Oftentimes because they're not using it correctly. I've seen it abused more, I think more times than I've seen it used correctly. And I hope that we're going to tackle the common issues now.
Absolutely. And as a second panelist, we've got Pooja Brown, who's the SVP, Head of Engineering at Stitch Fix. Welcome, Pooja. Could you give us a short intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's happy to be here. My name is Pooja Brown, SVP Engineering at Stitch Fix. I work with some amazingly talented engineers, data scientists, designers who build applications and services that help you be you, help style you. So I'm glad to be here talking about a really cool topic, which is OKRs and KPIs.
Excellent. And I've heard a rumor that you've removed the O from OKRs. Why is that?
Oh, we've been caught. We dropped the O. Well, actually, to be fair, we didn't really drop the O. But, when you think about, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot more deeper discussions here, but when you think about a company and its strategic objectives, to be successful at what you do, you need to have a few objectives and you need to ruthlessly prioritize for those objectives, right? And when you think of that, then if the company has their objectives clearly defined, then the teams are in service of those objectives and they're building key results or KPIs that align with that. So that was somewhat a simplification. Is at the Stitch Fix level, we have these key objectives, and at the team level, we have these key results that line up to it. So that's why we dropped the O.
Excellent. And Selena Deckelman, who is the SVP at Mozilla Firefox. Great to have you here. Could you give us a short intro, please?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Selena Deckelman. I am based in Portland, Oregon in the US, and I'm getting to kind of live the dream. When I was in college, my dream was to be like an open source hacker. So being able to work on Firefox and build a better web, like it's just an amazing thing that I get to do right now with an incredible team. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Excellent. And not to embarrass you, but how long have you been working with OKRs?
Like 1 million years. My very first job that I had actually was at Intel, and there they called it manage by objective, and then I had individual, objectives, IMBOs. But it's been a really long time, and I will say that it kind of that first experience there and how effective it was at getting alignment and getting our teams kind of on the same track and pulling in the same direction. It really set the stage for me to like them, like using them basically at every job I had after that.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have all three of you here. So let's kick off with more extensive questioning then. So Aviv, we'll start with you. So what are OKRs and how do they actually help with business alignment?
All right, so OKRs, Objectives and Key Results, are a framework that, as Alina just said, it originated in Intel, like many years ago, probably before I was born. And I think it was brought into prominence in our industry when one of the early investors in Google made them use it or encouraged them to use it and they liked it. And therefore, the entire industry started seeing that, hey, there's something here that seems to be working and start copying it. He's called John Doerr. If anyone wants to get some reading on the material, his book is a bestseller. It's called, I think, Measure What Matters, and it's an excellent introduction for OKRs. And basically, the objective of OKRs is to ensure that we get alignment by defining from the top and all the way down to the bottom of the organization, and in some companies to individuals, what is important, what we want to achieve, and how practically we are going to measure our success and our progress as we are moving towards those objectives. And it's a tool to distribute alignment throughout your organization. And I believe that it is, especially for engineering-oriented people, if done correctly, it can be really empowering, because all of a sudden you have a problem to tackle. And that is something that I think can really make your brightest people focused.
Great. And Pooja, any
Raviv,
additional thoughts?
I've read
Go
them.
ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I've read the Measure What Matters book, and I would highly recommend it at any stage, right? I think it applies to early tech startups. It applies to late stage companies. I felt every time I've read it, it's new meaning given the context I'm living in. But if you're trying to bootstrap yourself into it, it's a great book.
Okay, great. And one of the other books that I've read, the first book I read actually around OKRs was on Radical Focus, which I found as a nice light way to get into this as a way of doing this as well. Okay, then. So moving into the KPI part then. How are they different to OKRs, and how do they actually also help with business alignment? Selena?
Yeah, so I got a chance to talk with Pooja a little bit about this before the conference. And one of the things that came up in that conversation is when you start talking about OKRs and KPIs and a bunch of other 3-letter acronyms, it's really important to establish like what each person involved in that conversation really means, because honestly, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation and a lack of alignment just in what the intention is. So with KPIs, these are key performance indicators. And for me, these are the metrics that I am using to judge quantifiable performance over time. And it can be a little bit tricky to establish those in an organization. And we've actually at Mozilla, and specifically for Firefox, we think about these in a couple different ways. One, there are the KPIs that are oriented toward making sure that we're on track with the OKRs and the objectives that we've set for the year, or maybe like a 3-year time span. And then there are also guardrail KPIs. So there are performance indicators that might have to do with the application just performing well overall. And as long as we don't dip below that, then everything's fine. So there can be a variety of these, but they should be durable and quantifiable performance, performance that we're monitoring over some period of time.
Aviv, anything else you'd like to add?
Basically, that KPIs, there can be tons of them. I've seen too many companies set up, dashboards full of different KPIs. But I believe that we should try and choose only those that we're actually going to act differently by. So if you have a number that you're monitoring and you're not going to do anything different, if it fluctuates, there's no reason to keep tracking it and investing time in it. Some good KPIs that I've seen for engineering organizations are mentioned in the Accelerate book, if you've heard about it. And they have stuff like cycle time, mean time to resolution, and similar
feedback
stuff.
from Aviv there. I don't know whether that.
So yeah, we were just getting some feedback from Aviv there. So I tell you what, we'll come back to you in a moment, Aviv. I think the tech team are just going to have a quick look at how to solve that. Okay, so Pooja, let's come back to OKRs quickly. So how can you actually decide what OKRs to set, and how do you actually measure them?
This is some art, some science, right? So I think the KR side in my mind is very scientific, right? Which is similar to what Selena said. Like, I'll come back to the O. I have things with the O, but let's talk about the K and R first, right? Is that the key results in my mind, like as Selena said, is like they have to be measurable and quantifiable, right? And I think, the thing that I caution teams on, right, is that a lot of times when you're looking at specific numbers, like for example, you can say, we're in a e-commerce type like company. You can easily say that we want to have client growth by X% or revenue growth by Y%. When you do something like that, right, it is easy to get stuck in a cycle of essentially incremental progress. Because to do that, I could do multiple different things that are small, and one of them works out. So very akin to like growth hacking, right? But where I really encourage people is like when you're trying to make big moves, like for example, we're about to digitize our entire operations with how we work with vendors. That is a large project that needs milestones and sequencing. I wouldn't call it waterfall, but it still needs to think big in terms of how we get there. For things like that, I suggest key results that are much more in terms of design, build, deliver, adopt. They don't necessarily need to have numbers, but they need to be, you need to know at the end of it is that yes, within the time frame you agreed in, did you get to what you set out as a team to achieve? So that's sort of like how I think about key results. And you can say key results and there are aspects of KPIs, but the way we look at key results is like, can you at the end of it say, yes, we actually achieved what we set out to do? On the objective side, right, the way, that is a combination of, depends on what level you're talking. If you're talking in terms of business and company, right, those are objectives that the company, the executives, and their strategy team need to agree on, as these are the topmost things that accelerate our business. And they can be contextual to the business, right? Is it client growth? Is it new markets? Is it going international? Is it a cost efficiency goal? Is it a infrastructure goal, right? Those are things that need to be, that I imagine are the right objectives that then teams should be able to line up against. Now, again, I talked a lot about dropping the O. You don't have to. You can easily have an objective of, say, for example, an objective could be, we want to increase session time on the application by X seconds, right? And an objective for the team can be, we believe that if we had search on our application, we can get that. Right? So these can line up and cascade, but that's sort of how I think about objectives versus key results.
Okay. And Selena, what are your thoughts? And also maybe things around who sets these OKRs and when do you set them?
Yeah. The thing that was coming to mind as I was listening to Pooja was this opportunity that you have when you're able to set that cross-organizational objective, like getting that alignment at a high level. It really pays off down the road. And it also, I think, signals the leadership intent around, especially for me right now, like how I'm using OKRs is that there's a lot of change that we're inspiring in the organization to try to drive growth. So in that situation, signaling really strongly the magnitude of the change that's needed is really helpful to get alignment on up front. And then that also creates an opportunity for the teams that are like taking these on, taking either the objectives or any specific key results that come out of that on, that they have an opportunity to surface, is there some need, right? Like, do we need to get some new capabilities, or do we need to get more funding for a particular area? So that initial alignment, I feel like it's really important, especially like at the leadership level, to figure that all out so that when it comes to execution time, everybody's able to kind of pull in the same direction.
Great.
By the way,
And
Selena,
Aviv, anything? Sorry, go ahead, Pooja.
Yeah.
I was agreeing with something you said, which is like, it's a massive change management tool,
Yes.
right? It's like, that's a really good way to put it, is that if the company's aligned with this change, right, then the OKRs and the formats and the cascading impact serve as a change management. So you are prepared and you can react to something that's about to happen.
And it's a very crisp way to communicate it. So developing the discipline around exactly how you're going to talk through these things and then deliver that message to the organization. It's like getting that alignment at the leadership level and then making the communication really crisp and clear to the whole organization. It's not always like, it doesn't always like work out perfectly as you go out, but there's so much that can be learned, and I would say I've been through learning process this year. We set a very aggressive change goal, and it inspired the right kinds of changes in the organization, right? Like we really tackled some difficult growth problems that we maybe had put aside as like either impossible or just like that just wasn't worth doing in the past. And what we discovered this year was that, it really was useful. So the specific thing I'm thinking of is that we empowered teams to think about set to default for Firefox, and that was like an important area. And in the past, like we just sort of, not really pursued that as like a specific goal. So it was only through that process of saying we have this very aggressive goal and we'd like the teams to really kind of open the floodgates and just look across the entire organization and see what might be done, that we got them to that place where they started taking action independently and found these areas for growth.
And Aviv, do you have any other thoughts or maybe around the measuring part of the OKRs?
Around the what, sorry?
The measuring aspects of OKRs. Because I can imagine that probably being the hardest part of determining how you actually measure.
Yeah, well, hopefully from the get-go, you can make sure that at least some of the OKRs are measurable, as in are not binary. They're not, we either completed it or not. So you don't get to the end of the quarter and you're like, oh, we didn't get to that. If you can have some measure of progress, that's excellent. So, for example, you have a big change in architecture, maybe count the number of microservices that need to be migrated, the number of integrations that we need to complete by the end of the month, something like that. Those are always nice to have. And if you're working as an example that was given earlier to improve the session time by a few seconds, maybe you can even inch away and say we got 1 second more, 2 seconds. That's always nice. And I would say that one of the most important things about measurement is to make sure that you do it as you go along. I've seen companies just forget about the OKRs until 2 days before the meeting where we want to review them, and they're like, oh, how do we even measure it? That's like a great waste of time.
Excellent.
That's such a good point. Actually, that sparked a thought for me about a deeper thought about measurement. One of the things that we spent a ton of time on as we were thinking about how to create the right incentives was the specific user behaviors that we wanted to measure. And this is really tricky for us as a browser. It's similar to an operating system. It's a little bit challenging to just pick like one specific thing and make sure that the whole organization is aligned around that. But what we decided on here through a lot of conversation and a very good alignment generating exercise was thinking about days of use and the impact that has on a user's life. If we find that people are able to use Firefox like more days, like whole days, as opposed to maybe like the number of minutes or seconds or something like that they're on web pages, that to us was just a much more effective way of thinking about the value that we're adding for people. And I think this is like a really important set of inquiries to be very critical about when you're choosing your initial key results and KPIs, because it may seem like there's alignment around a particular metric, but until you really kind of interrogate it and think about how you're going to use it and what kind of work that's going to incentivize throughout the whole organization, I think you don't really know. So I just encourage anybody that's looking into this, make sure you're very critical and you ask a lot of questions and really dig in there and see how you're going to use it before committing to something right off the bat.
Great. Okay, then. So Pooja, so let's say we've found, we've identified fantastic business OKRs or KPIs. How do you actually translate those down to the engineering teams?
It's a bit of bottoms up and ground, sort of top down, bottoms up process. I used the expression incorrectly here, but, ultimately, right, it would be odd if the business went in a room and came up with these and now said, okay, go teams, figure it out, right? Or it would be odd if the teams came up with the plan and then the business said, okay, those are our objectives, right? So it's sort of a very cross-functional process, no matter what, right? I think even for us to get something as an objective, there is generally what I call is osmosis or immersion into the problem. that has to have happened to it, right? For example, if you want to say we want to get into a subscription or loyalty or membership, right? That doesn't show up as an objective by surprise, right? There's a business case, there's a strategy team that goes out and figures out if there's value in there, right? There's vetting, there's a lot of discussions pre that to even feel that, okay, this is something that we're going to actually go pursue. So I think already there's some amount of collaboration that's happening, right? And if you are a software company, you know that you can't, it's never, I came up with an idea and now go tell me what this costs, right? So it's a much more collaborative process. So with that, right, I feel in general, objectives should not be surprises. These are things that the tech teams as well as the business, like Selena, you're smiling. I fully, 100%, like if it's a surprise, you failed as a business. Right. So like that would be so, but from a timing perspective, yes, like at our company, like we set these objectives at a yearly basis, right? Because there's a budget associated with it. There's lots of sort of cascading impacts of an OKR, as there's lots of teams that probably have to align with the fact that we're going to deliver these OKRs, right? So in general, like we try to follow the calendar / financial year. We have a set of these OKRs that have been vetted, agreed, or a continuation of things that we saw success in and we want to continue to make progress on. So that would be like a fairly collaborative process. And the way it works for us is that we have monthly updates against it, where it is very clear what KRs are red, yellow, and green, and what decisions that need to be made knowing that. So, you probably, I think all of us have been in projects that have taken twice the time that you thought it was going to take, or if not more, right? And being able to help the teams understand that that's okay is also a very important part of this, right? The monthly check-ins are less around, hey, like it's they're definitely, are we on track or not, and can we use easy colors like red, yellow, and green to indicate that? But that also allows the teams to be much more agile in their decision making, right? If something has changed, some aspect has changed, how do we react to that, and what is the impact on the other KRs? The thing that I'll be honest that I don't think we've figured this out well is prioritization in your KRs. Right. And I think we're still trying to figure out whether that's needed. I think in systems that are highly coupled, you end up having to stack rank in some form. I think if you've built out a system where you can kind of do a full stack impact of your KR, great. I've never worked in those companies, frankly. So we're still trying to figure out the stack ranking of KRs.
Great. Aviv, any thoughts around this?
Yeah, first of all, when it comes to prioritization, I completely agree. It always becomes an issue as the company grows. And I found that if you are looking into it, in the book we mentioned earlier, they say that you should be aiming so that for each of your objectives, whether they are hard commitments or I think they call it stretch goals. And I think it is very helpful when it comes to prioritization to know that some of them are, this is set in stone. We're gonna do this. We have to do this. The business depends on it. And there are stretch goals, as in we want to hit X million users by the end of the month. But we know it's a stretch goal, and even if we only get to 70 or 80% of that, that's going to be nice. So there's that. And also, I just want to mention something that I don't think we talked about. We're talking about translating business OKRs down to engineering teams. I have a hack, and I think that it's becoming more and more popular, and that is when we are working in empowered product teams, you have less steps of translation to perform because the OKR usually comes from the product person that's in charge of that team or that subunit, and that usually makes the objective a lot more concise and concrete and understandable by the engineering team. It seems to really go hand in hand in those situations. So if you can do that, I think that's always a plus. And lastly, one more thing is I want to make sure that everyone here understands that you don't have to use OKRs only for business stuff. I actually advise my clients to try and come up with OKRs for personal growth of their engineers. Like someone has an objective to be more out there and build their own personal brand. Maybe we can work on making that engineer go to conferences and speak and submit blog posts to the company's engineering blog and that sort of stuff.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So I've just got one last question before we go into the audience questions, which I think is probably going to be really helpful for most people. So we'll start off with you, Aviv. So what are the pitfalls that you've seen using OKRs or KPIs?
I think we touched a bit on most of the most common pitfalls. But first of all, you cannot spontaneously come up with your own objectives from the engineering team. As Pooja said, we can't start from down below, and then leadership would have to say, "Oh, I'm guessing that aligns with whatever we had in mind when it comes to the roadmap." And I've seen literally like 2 weeks ago, CEOs coming up to their CTOs and VPs and telling them, we need OKRs, so let me know what your OKRs are by next week. And the CTO is like, what does that mean? So we have to stop with the cargo call thing, and we have to be brave enough to say when we're abusing this tool. That's number one. Number two would be to be aware of the drift that happens. I've seen situations where companies have amazing kickoffs for a new quarter, and we have the objectives, and everything seems amazingly planned, and it is concise, and people understand exactly where we want to go. But startups, 2 weeks later, something changes. Apple decides to announces a ATT, or something changes in the industry, and 2 weeks later, half of your objectives no longer matter, and no one actually goes through updating it and communicating it correctly. We just start, rolling with the punches, and that makes the organization as a culture tend to not believe that this is something that actually matters, and it chips away at the trust when it comes to actually using this as something that we measure ourselves by. So I really recommend for everyone in leadership in all levels, make sure that we go back to the OKRs, make sure that they are still relevant and that they make sense, because otherwise, again, this is just playing in make-believe.
Pooja, have you seen any big pitfalls or mistakes with OKRs or KPIs?
Yeah, I think Aviv sort of touched on some of it, right? Is that I truly believe that the rigidity of it can be detrimental to an organization. I think no matter how big you are, right, is that these are indicators that will tell you whether your investments are the right investments, right? And like being able to have that conversation. I feel a lot of times teams are not able to, I would say, highlight or escalate things in red. I think generally engineers are very optimistic. So you'll see a lot of yellows and greens. And I think if you're seeing a lot of yellows and greens, I would encourage you to dig in and really understand, are those truly yellows or are they reds? And like having that honest conversation and creating that space where that's okay is where I think, whether these KRs are effective or not matters. And I've seen a lot of teams kind of get caught in that cycle of, your leadership just wants to see yellows and greens. Actually, no, I want to see the reds, because most likely we might be overly optimistic in what we thought we could achieve. So that was, I think, the rigidity of those is where I see the pitfalls to happen. And I think, you said it really, well, is that, these KRs are top down, bottoms up as much. Right. And like having your own KRs that now you need to go figure out how it aligns with the company's OKRs, like that's just recipe for disaster. Right. It has to start with, this is like company's objectives. These are the things we want to prioritize. Now, I don't want to say that you lose autonomy as technology teams, right? Is that because tech teams know what's best for their systems. But quite frankly, if the top doesn't tell you that infrastructure or tech investments are important, then guess what? I'm most likely going to do keep the lights on work, and that's it. So it's a really important signal both ways of how technology is viewed.
Great. And Selena, have you got anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll just underscore like that point about the reds. What's really important about that, in addition to, maybe people are giving yellows when they are reds, is those reds are often where there's a ton of learning happening, because people just ran into a brick wall. and so like that's I think a really important place to spend a little time and kind of understand like what happened and what we learned from that. And then I would say, going back to the keep the lights on, versus technology investments, I see a regular mistake is like no attention paid and no prioritization for really important sustaining work that the organization needs to have happen. As a steward of an implementation of the web platform, this is a regularly occurring prioritization problem for us, and it happens at a smaller scale, I think, at many companies. But it's really, really important to make those investments, and sometimes they can be just part of your normal cycle. Somebody gets to the end of some critical piece of work, and then you just make time. So coming up with a strategy for how you're going to make some of that time available to the engineering teams, I think it's just it pays off in the end if you do that now.
Excellent. Okay, then. So for some of the audience questions, we've had lots come through. I'll start off with what are good KPIs that we can use for product and engineering teams? Who would like to have a crack at that first?
I mentioned earlier that if you
go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. If you check out the Accelerate book, which I think is excellent, it mentions some of the key aspects for measuring teams. I think it mentions cycle time, mean time to resolution, and similar metrics for the health of your engineering organization. Some companies also use KPIs for stuff like the happiness of our employees, how long the builds are taking, and everything in between. Basically, if you can make a good decision based on it, I think it's a good KPI. Sorry.
Excellent. Okay then. So anyone else want to comment? I think Aviv covered that very well. So moving on to the next question, probably Pooja's probably nicely aligned for this one. How do you drive engagement with OKRs?
I think it is an important tool to align the company, which means that the company has to have OKRs. Right. I've seen sort of this being a tech team or tech and product team thing, and the company has their own like strat planning process, and that's recipe for failure, right? Is that you as a company, as a leadership team, your C-levels have to agree that OKRs is an instrument that drives decision making for the company. And I think that's sort of, and the drumbeat that follows post to that is how you drive engagement. Right, these are non-negotiable processes. We are reviewing these KRs at this cadence. The results of those are published so people can look at it. Right, it's a signal. Honestly, it's a signal from the C-suite. Otherwise, if the minute you make this a tech and product thing, the drift that Aviv talked about will just happen naturally.
Excellent. Anyone else want to add to that? Nope. Okay, then. We'll move on to the next question. Go ahead.
Sorry. Just one more thing. I think that adding personal OKRs, as I mentioned earlier, for personal group of people can make them more interested in the process as a whole.
Brilliant. Okay, then. So for the next question, do you have any advice on how to align the engineering OKRs with business product goals? So as you're talking about then about the communication piece, is there any difference with aligning these actual OKRs with the business and product goals?
I guess I can jump on this one and say one thing, from the Radical Focus book, you can have one objective. It is a radical approach, and my team did that this year, and what we learned from that was that it was highly effective at getting alignment because everybody just kind of had to sit in a virtual room together and talk about exactly what all the words meant to them. That was an extremely helpful exercise. We ended up deciding that, there were certain parts of the organization that also needed additional objectives, but that initial level set of saying, actually, we're all going to agree on the direction that we're headed together. It was incredibly helpful for getting that initial alignment, and we use the same words, and I would say that the word choosing process wasn't perfect or without pain, but it was, in the end, everybody just had to acknowledge that they played a part in creating that, and it was powerful going forward in ensuring that people had alignment through the whole year.
Excellent. If there's no more additional comments, I'll move into the next question. How do you handle the difference of time frame sensibility for product and engineering versus the company's OKRs?
That's an interesting question. And maybe if I could clarify a little bit more, is that, help me understand what is the time frame sensibility you're talking in terms of, the way I'll explain the way I interpret it is that at a company level, right? Typically, we see OKRs that are set up for the year or objectives that are set up for the year, and then at a product and engineering level, we typically think of those as milestones at a quarterly time frame. Right. So that's sort of one of the things that I mentioned early on, is that gives you that moves you out of incrementality of not being able to make big bets, because say a company has made a big bet of, I don't know, I want to go international or I want to go to a new continent, right? That could be a 1-year goal for your company. That could be a multi-year goal, right? As a technology and a product team, you probably know an objective like that requires various milestones that get you there. And if you tell me that those are not trackable on a monthly or a quarterly basis, I'm going to call bullshit on that. So excuse my word. So it's just sort of like, when you think of it that way, right? That's sort of like, I think what we are very good at is taking a big thing and breaking up into smaller things and making progress on it. Mm-hmm. And that's how I would think of the difference of timeframes between what the company wants and what the product and technology teams can deliver.
Excellent. I think you answered that very well. Okay, then. So this next question, I think, will help me understand a lot more about how you actually execute against the OKRs. So, what differentiates weekly OKR routines from agile sprint goals?
Well, I can tell you in practice what my team actually does, or it's really an organization, not just an individual team. So the agile sprint goals, our sprints are typically 2 weeks, so there's just a difference there. And they're not expecting in the sprints that the outcome of a sprint is going to have immediate impact, right, on an OKR. That's typically not what happens. Our weekly OKR reviews are just checking in to see, for the things that are planned to be delivered, what was the impact? Did they deliver? Was there any observed change in a KPI, or did we resolve a key result? So that separation is really pretty clear in my mind.
I agree. I always tell my clients that we need to keep in mind that there's a gap between I finish with the code till we actually see some results out in the wild. And sometimes even if you see results, product people, analysts, people need to look at it and decide, was this the right change? Is this really a change, or just a spike because people saw the blog post and they stopped using the feature after a week? You have to really learn how to live with this gap. Which means, by the way, that you shouldn't be aiming to finish all of your work like the day the OKRs are due, the end of the quarter, because you're going to have a bad time. And another point is that I recommend to have meta reviews. So if you have retrospectives as part of your agile sprints, so you retrospect what you've done when it comes to purely the execution, meta reviews are like, let's say, 2 months later, with product, with everyone involved in coming up with the OKRs that made us come up with those sprints and the work we decided to do. Let's see if we had some sort of misalignment there. Did we do some work that was, not really necessary to hit that goal? Did we not develop the work enough, and we stopped at something that wasn't really an MVP? That sort of stuff, I think, can also help in that cadence.
Okay, great. Okay, so for the next question, is it wrong to have KRs phrased as roadmap deliverables? For example, deliver X feature in Q4. Is that a bad OKR? Well, a bad KR. Why?
And I can maybe take, I talked a little bit earlier about build, delivery, or design, build, delivery, adoption, right? Like, I think if that's a measurable thing and it's understood, I think it's a fine KR, right? But like you have to agree on what delivery means. I think people get lost in delivery as well. Does delivery mean you wrote the code and you shipped it? Does delivery mean you onboarded customers on it? Or does delivery mean that you went GA with this feature? Right? Whatever the understanding is in the terms of delivery, I think that's important to agree, right? I would say is like deliver feature X in Q4. If this is your KR for the entire year, then that's a problem too, right? Is that this, I would look at it as like, deliver, this could be a feature, maybe it's a multi-quarter feature potentially. Then I still think that it's a multi-quarter feature where you're saying you want to deliver this by the end of the year, then there has to be KRs per quarter that line up for it. And it might just be, I am okay with if you say, we're going to deliver an architectural plan for this, right? That's the first milestone. Then we're going to deliver, then we're going to build it, then we're going to test. Like I understand we can break them up in that way, but something is deliver feature X in Q4. I don't know how you can measure progress against it if you're making that your entire year's KR.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, essentially, it doesn't sound like an OKR because it's not high enough level. Delivering a feature doesn't prove business value from my
Exactly right.
perspective. Okay, great. And the last question I'm just going to run from the audience. It takes some non-zero time for OKRs to be scored, written, and trickled up down the hierarchy. Do you have any tips for that to run smoothly and effectively?
This is a very obvious tip, but schedule the time to do that well in advance and block out the time in everybody's calendar to do it. It seems so obvious, but I find myself amazed. Like every time we get to this point, it's like, oh, we need to do the mid-year scoring. Okay, where's the meeting where we're going to do that? Fortunately, my team, we kind of have, especially during the pandemic, we've adopted a strategy of having extra meeting time with all of us together that we can kind of co-op for things like this if for some reason like a meeting slips through the cracks. But I would just say you got to schedule the time to do it, and then I would say just do it as quickly as you can too, because a lot of people, they try to make this perfect and you end up dragging out the scoring over too long a period of time. And it's better to get the scoring done and report out on it, even if it's not like perfectly assessed, because then you can move on to the next thing. Because the time marches on, and it's not an effective thing to sit with unscored OKRs because you can't schedule a meeting.
Brilliant. And as we've only got like a minute and a half left, I'm just going to quickly allow each of you just to give your top tips and tricks for being able to run OKRs or KPIs successfully. Pooja, what would be your key points?
Having been through, Agile and Scrum and Scaled Agile and OKRs and KPIs, right? I think we've all sort of gone through the evolution of all of this, right? I think there's something about like if you zoom out of it for a second, and like it is an agreement amongst a company, and it is a commitment to follow towards it. Right. If you can zoom out at that level, then some of the, like I see a lot of like philosophical arguments over, well, this is better, that's better. Is this a good KR versus not? Right. Ultimately, it's a commitment. It's a commitment to move the business forward and a framework to track against it. And in fact, me as an engineer, I want to make sure whatever I'm working on has impact for the business in some form. I find that being the most unsettling thing for engineers is I come in, I write a bunch of code. I don't know how this helps where, right? And this is, in my mind, a language and a framework to get to that, right? If you can, I would recommend if leaders, everybody, if you can just sort of align on that, then KRs are just another tool. I'm sure in 5 years there'll be another way to do this, and we'll be hearing from new people who think it's much cooler than KRs.
Great. Well, essentially we're running out of time now, I'm afraid. So we'll let Aviv and Selena also add to like the message chat on AirMeet. So apologies for that. So thank you very much for time for joining us today, Pooja, Aviv, and Selena, for speaking with us, and thank you to the audience for such great questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference.